Sustainability can often seem like a depressing catalog of doom and gloom. But although we face serious challenges, a better and more sustainable future is possible. Welcome to Sustainable Planet.
Welcome to part 2 of Mangroves, our celebratory one-year anniversary episode of Sustainable Planet. I'm political scientist Kimberly Weir, and my co-host is Jordan Dye, a guy who knows an awful lot about sustainability issues. In part 1, we talked about why mangroves are an amazing and vital ecosystem, but they're in jeopardy. In addition to losing these carbon sinkholes, mangrove deforestation increases coastal erosion and pollution globally, threatening the plants, animals, and humans who are dependent on them. So, Jordan, who's working to save the mangroves?
As usual, the usual suspects are working at it, but I think in this way, it's really the NGOs that are leading the efforts on this. I think, as we'll get into, for reasons government efforts and corporate efforts are really stalled out along economic lines, and the really exciting work's happening in that NGO space.
For sure, I agree with you. This is the sort of thing that NGOs thrive on and live for, right? Helping people and the planet. And this is where we definitely see evidence of that. There are so many different groups. I had an interesting experience when I was in Madagascar. I met volunteers from an NGO. It was just a small NGO. I can't remember the name of it. But they were there actually replanting mangrove trees. And it was a really cool thing that they were doing. And I actually wanted to stop off and just help them because they're like, this is such an important thing you're doing. Thank you. And I should have pictures of that. So I'll try to make that the picture for this episode if I can find those.
Really cool to see.
Yeah. And so we do. There are lots. Probably one of the most prominent is the Global Mangrove Alliance. It is one of the biggest ones. But also early on, the World Wildlife Fund, what I like to think of as the original and still authentic WWF. For people who are, I guess maybe that might not even be a thing people know about anymore, right? Is that the World Wrestling Entertainment, complex now, I don't even know what they're called anymore, that they tried to be WWF and they lost out the battle to World Wildlife Fund that had started in 1960.
That's why we have the WWE, right?
Yes, so it is still called E. Okay, I thought so. So the WWF, they have the mangroves for community and climate. And what they realized very early on in their campaign was it was one thing to try to save the wildlife, but unless they had investments in the local communities, it didn't matter how much they threw at conservation efforts. They had to have buy-in from the locals, because if they were being shortchanged, they were going to continue poaching. They were going to continue deforesting and whatever it was, because they needed those resources. And why should they care what, people halfway around the world thought about what was going on in their community if they didn't have an investment in those actual people? People care more about elephants than they do about humans.
No, exactly. And I think that this really drives the best way to approach these, especially as somebody who works in the non-governmental area. When working with local communities, you need to start from a place of empathy and understanding that they're actually making the most rational and best decision that they can. And so if you start from that place, and especially on mangroves, you can understand that, okay, we need to replace the income. We need to replace the benefit that they're getting from taking this ecosystem. Otherwise, it is just a form of moralism, in my opinion, of going and telling, do better, and starting from that place of, no, they're actually doing the thing that makes the most sense. And we need to shift that calculus and help.
Well, I think too, not even just replacing, but giving them even a bit more, because then they say, well, I can continue to poach and then I can get this extra money on the side. But having that set up in such a way that it's absolutely important and you are getting much more of a benefit by having this investment, I think that really helps, right?
Yeah. Sorry.
So I was just going to say too, one of my other favorites is the Blue Carbon Group, because I don't know if perhaps it came before Blue Man Group, or maybe Blue Man Group was inspired by Blue Carbon Group. I don't know, but that's another big one that's out there, and I think that's important because that their name in and of itself, first of all, maybe I don't know if it works to their benefit or not, right? Because on the one hand, it's like, well, it draws attention to blue carbon because they're helping with mangroves. And also shows that it's more than just save the manatees is more than just save the manatee, right? You can adopt a manatee. Well, you can adopt a mangrove tree, but you're saving a lot more than just that. It requires a lot more, as we talked about in part 1. But with Blue Carbon Group, maybe it's lost on people. People just don't even know to make that association unless they bother to delve into it.
I think it's really important also to separate from other carbon, market activities, right? And so, because so much of them is focused on, in the natural processes sphere on forest reforestation, right? And typically, for the most part, in global north countries. And I think that going to blue carbon and really anchors that this is a concern of the oceanic regions and the coastal regions of the globe, particularly in that tropical and subtropical region. And so, it allows people that's their area of interest to focus on it. But I think it drives that there are distinctions, and then you can get to the point of that we made in the last episode of how much more carbon is stored this way. Right. So it's also a differentiator and then allows it to elevate itself in relation to, I think, some of the other natural. And so great idea from the group.
Yeah. And I hope they get the attention that's deserved of them because of that. And I think you make sort of an important point. I'm not sure how much you really hit on it when you were just talking to bring home the point that we need to reduce carbon dioxide emissions, full stop. And here's a really big important chunk of how we can really help to do that. That's not trying to, recapture or draw it from the atmosphere or whatever. I mean, like, this is something that all we need to do is protect what's already there. And it's already working way better for us than anything else.
I think that, in the same way. So when I talk to corporations about climate issues, it's always basically emission reductions first, then offsets, right? And then alternatives. So it's kind of, that's the ladder. You should be reducing that absolute amount. And I think that it's similar here. Our first step on any of this should be enhancing the and saving the natural processes already doing it. We will need to do engineered solutions and find ways on top of it because of the system we've created. That's fine. But the more we can do to protect what the earth does so well starts us off at a better baseline and means, as your point, the changes that we need to make have to be less drastic and less rapid. So great point, Kimberly.
And I think if we go back to we did a whole episode on Amazon, basically with subscribe and save. And that's one of the things that Amazon is actually doing here. They created the Right Now Climate Fund. And just, we're not proponents for Amazon necessarily or anything, and we're certainly not being endorsed or paid by them. But that's something that as you just mentioned, that having a corporation recognize, hey, we need to offset, we need to figure out, we need an action plan, we need to figure out a way that we can reduce our carbon footprint. And by creating Right Now Climate Fund, here's a way to support sustainability operations. So they have one in India. So Amazon India is investing $1.2 million over 3 years in mangrove restoration. They have one that's the Amazon Netherlands that established a seaweed farm for carbon capture and storage. And that's something that's really interesting with the Netherlands, just what's going on, because they don't have mangroves, but they got huge coastlines, and they've got definitely absolutely have concerns about one is one of the three low-lying countries, right? When the Benelux countries, some of it's actually like Rotterdam is 1/3 of Rotterdam's underwater. And so these are things that are real concerns for them. And so having these seaweed farms for carbon capture and storage, and then the added bonus of having that be that barrier and help to do basically what a mangrove does in other parts of the world, like, that's great stuff. And so there are companies, corporations that have, they're investing in this front end. Or I don't even know if it's a front end. Like, they're investing in this aspect of it, which is a lot easier than some of the other stuff that they could do that would be much more costly.
No, exactly. And it gets to our point of protecting those ecosystem services that are driving benefits. And I think that's a great tie-in that even in the Netherlands, going back to the last episode, my example of what got me on this topic with just, build the dikes. When you look at the Netherlands, have the most extensive and honestly amazing dike system in the world.
Impressive, yes.
Country wouldn't exist without it. But even they are reaching their limits of engineering or their limits of cost benefit on that, and are now even themselves turning back to, hey, what are some of the natural ways we can do this to limit what we have to do on the human side? And I think that just right there drives that the natural systems are the important ones we should be focusing on.
Yeah. And when it comes to corporations, like, a lot of times, so one of the biggest obvious things that most people are probably familiar with is just the carbon market, right? The buying and selling of carbon offsets. It goes by so many different names and often confusing for people because it's carbon pricing, carbon trading, cap and trade. We had a whole episode on cap and trade if you missed that. So, we actually go into that quite in depth earlier. Go back to that episode. But it's, it's a very controversial sort of approach to dealing with this environmental issue, because on the one hand, it can be really a great thing. But oftentimes, on the other hand, it's abused, and that's why it's less of a great thing. So, what are your thoughts on the carbon market?
Well, so most of my work is all around carbon markets, both in compliance markets and then what we would call voluntary markets. A lot of my actual day job revolves around renewable energy credits and looking at carbon markets around renewable energy, but also more recently into carbon removals and carbon removal markets. I think you basically laid out the summary great. There can be great advantages of them and as a great mechanism for rewarding or financing activities. And then we have a lot of examples of how they've been used negatively. And in recent years, actually, a lot of what I would say are, questionable or just outright bad practices between 2010 and 2020 have really led to a pullback from corporations because one of the bad things here is no company wants to be accused of greenwashing, even if they're a company that is greenwashing, right? Like you don't want to be accused of it. And then for a lot of companies, I work with a lot of sustainability offices, and I always say, whatever issue I'm talking to you about is not your core competency. Your business is great at selling something or making something, and now you're turning your attention to try to do this. So carbon markets for a long time offered companies what they thought was a way of giving money and funneling it to the experts and the projects that were doing the work. And then so you look at some of the backlash, and especially in nature-based offsets in forests, a lot of overcounting, or my personal biggest issue with them is a lot of the forest fires that have ripped through carbon market forests. No company that I'm aware of, and if any listener can correct me on this, I would love it, but no company's taken those emissions back on their books, which would be the true morally right and just accounting right way of doing it, right? So I think that at a high level, you really have to look at how that specific carbon market is set up and how they are regulated. Now, in the case of these markets that we're talking about here, most of them are actually voluntary markets. So, Amazon, when they're purchasing, blue carbon credits, it's typically not from a regulated entity. Now, they are monitored and there are international standards. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol is one of the leading organizations that actually sets the standards for these. So there are ways to make sure you're getting high quality credits. But again, this is done in the voluntary market. And from my perspective, I do like this. It drives money to the issue. It gives away a company of quantifying it. And at the end of the day, I don't think that every single company should be trying to build their own one-off program. It's not going to lead to the mass benefits, and it's not going to funnel the money to where we can have the most impact. So I think carbon markets offer, if done right, a nice way of doing that. I'm sorry for my rant on carbon.
No, not at all. No, I think it makes me think it's the same sort of issue that plagues the cocoa industry, because it's a voluntary protocol, basically, where it's up to the top 7 companies, chocolatiers in the world, to put this together, fund it, and so forth. And some companies along the way, their answer has been, well, we just have our own project that we're doing here, and like Cadbury, for one example, that's changed names 17 times since then, but sorry. But with Cadbury, they had a very specific flavor for their dairy milk chocolate, and they wanted to preserve that community in a sustainable way to make sure that they had that same quality control of the flavor, consistent flavor of the chocolate. But then they use that as the excuse of why they're not going to pay more into the protocol to protect more of the cocoa industry worldwide, right? And so it's basically, when we go back to carbon, it's this polluter pays model, where basically we're in a capitalist system. So of course, this is how businesses are going to look at this, and they're going to approach it from. And it's based on free market supply and demand. If there is a demand for these permits, somebody who's going to supply them. And so they can be really good in the ways that you described. And that the ones that then tend to get the negative publicity are so-and-so was buying carbon permits in a forest that was already really protected or under state protection or something anyway, or some conservation group had already been doing the work. And they're not really contributing anything to this. And so without international laws in place, like the Cocoa Protocol, right, along those lines, without have something international law that have real repercussions, When it's just voluntary, then you're not going to have that same sort of meaningful impact and the repercussions if you don't follow the rules.
No, it's such a great point. And I mean, even in the designs of these, there's trade-offs we run into when designing carbon markets all the time. And in a lot of ways, if you follow out the design of any carbon market, it doesn't always make sense. So a great way is, renewable energy, right? So just as a quick example, when you're calculating your emissions from, energy, you use the grid factor for where you're pulling your energy. And then if you buy a bunch of renewable energy and it has to be additional. So you got to the point of they're often buying old things where this can happen. And that gets to in all carbon markets, you need to look for additionality. It's whether it's in mangroves, blue carbon, forest, it has to be above the natural rate, right? Now, so the company, sorry, my example here, when the company buys a lot of renewable energy, they're taking that amount off and saying that they reduced that amount, but it actually reduces for the whole grid. So there's a little bit of double counting there. Now, the tension is if you don't allow for that double counting, there's no incentive to make the investment. So you get less renewables on average, but it would be more technically right. And so in all of these systems, there's this trade-off between going for the perfect system that reflects reality and creating a system that will actually drive that investment so you get to reap the benefits. And I think that's at the core of a lot of the tensions around these systems.
Well, and when you were talking about those that have that forest that were now, victims of forest fires, that the first thought that came to my head was, okay, so not only are they possibly still having these on the books as something that's, carbon permit trade-off offset, but what about all those emissions that were released then because of the forest fires? They're certainly not counting those. So they talk about double counting. This is like double counting in the negative, right? Taking credit for something that doesn't even exist anymore and not even basically accounting for all of the pollution that was released as a result of this.
No, exactly. And which is why I lead with it as my critique of carbon systems, because I think that I want carbon systems to be a big part of how we fight climate change, because at the end of the day, I think it's the best way to drive corporate action. And as we've talked about on so many episodes, that system is what's driving yours and my end harm. But I think that you have to acknowledge the ways they've failed, because we need to. And this is what's really going on right now. This is maybe a really interesting broader discussion. There's a lot of changes going on in carbon markets and how these things are counted, and even the voluntary standards, because they've seen that lack of trust and they're trying to ramp it up. And it's also one of the areas, going back to why I think blue carbon is really smart and separating itself out from, because it actually keeps it away from some of the issues we've seen in other aspects of carbon markets.
Well, and I think that at a time with just the global political climate of retraction from commitments to everything, when we talk about corporations backing away from ESG funds, and also then moving to international organizations just losing their funding flat out, losing one of the biggest supporters for some of these projects and dictate like mandates, whatever, to try to reduce climate change and commitments to the environment. Like, these are places that are taking big hits. And so trying to rely on intergovernmental organizations like the UN Environment Program. Okay, so they've got the RED program. That's the horrible, right? Reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. Okay, RED program, just stick with that and you'll know. Which is also, you think that's also weird because it's red and you're trying to describe something that's blue and, whatever. I just had a problem with their acronym and their name. But the point is to try to give countries financial incentives to reduce deforestation and conserve mangroves. And that's a great thing. But, we're talking about the 121 countries needing that funding for mangroves, which is one small thing in a big giant pot of a whole bunch of different environmental issues that are going on. And, a lot of people don't even really think about, for the UNEP to even be effective, they also have to worry about what's going on in the ground with the locals, because they need to help preserve quality of life for people, because they're not going to be able to conserve the environment if the people's needs aren't being met. So then they necessarily have to coordinate with others, and they're all fighting for that same pot. And then, we have also with the UN, FCCC, et cetera, also just call it climate change and be done with it already, right?
Another UN program.
So let's just go with that, right? We've got the Mangrove Breakthrough, which was, great because it's a multi-stakeholder initiative to try to billions of dollars to protect lots of mangroves by, really short time, 2030. So, but they have some projects that they're working, but if you're actually gonna, and we're actually going to try to rely on them to save the day, is just not happening.
No, 100%. And I think there's two big things here. One, so like we talked about in the first episode that, 62% of mangrove losses over the last 20 years were driven by land use change. 80% of those losses were concentrated in only 6 Southeast Asian countries. And that, I think, and it's all driven by economic reasons there and the mass deforestation. So really, while we're talking about doing this everywhere, actually for these intergovernmental agencies to put pressure on 6 countries that have clearly made the economic choice in their kind of setup that it's worth the destruction gets really hard, because you're fighting against billions in entrenched interest and entrenched value.
But Jordan, what we're talking about here is the fact that these countries are lauded for their mass economic growth and development. They're not chastised because, oh, you destroyed some mangroves along the way, and oh, your conservation effort's been kind of crappy. No, they're being like, oh, held up as, Asian tigers and all of these Southeast Asian like wonder stories because of this. And so it's not just those countries that are being, they are not just rewarding this in and of themselves. They are being rewarded by others for this. And yes, this is where, if you're the one in the government and you have to make this decision, are you going to go for the economic development and say, oh, well, we'll try to deal with these environmental issues? Yeah, now that people are in a better situation, you can't really blame governments in developing countries for doing this, because one, global North countries did this already in a way worse, way more destructive way.
If I ever get to my retirement and have time to sit down and finally write a book on sustainability, the one I'd write, the name I've always had in my brain is Burning Our Roots, because I think that everything, and you just hit it, our system was built by burning the actual, that unseen foundation that allows for prosperity. And we're repeating it again in the developing world. And I think that that's the image in my mind, right? You see the forest growing and you think everything's good, and you're lauding these countries for their massive growth and look how great it is, without realizing that below that ground, they're burning away the entire thing that allows for the long term. So
yeah, that's a great analogy. I hope that you retire soon so I can read this.
I did want to stop on the mangrove breakthrough because they're connected to the Global Mangrove Alliance. And I think a lot of times, and this is as one who works in organizations like this, sometimes when you hear our goals, you're like, well, okay, you're not going to do that. It's just, it almost seems like you set up to fail because of how, and they're needed. They're always connected to a scientific outcome, but it's not going to happen. And I really liked the Mangrove Breakthroughs goals. Now, the 2030 timeline, again, and we're talking 5 years from now, with most of the investment decisions needed in the next 2 or 3 to see that. But the goals, I think, are measured and reasonable. So the first goal is halt global losses from humans. And again, 62% of that driven, and it's all within our control, is their point, right? We are the ones actively doing it. We can stop that. Restore half of the losses. Now, this one's actually was really interesting to me because of the 11,000 square kilometers, that have been lost over the last 2 decades, 8,000 square kilometers are still categorized as able to be restored or saved. So a large majority of what we've lost in the most recent years, we could save again. And I think that's they're not even going that. They're talking about half of the losses, right? Now, and then their final goal is doubling protection. It was really interesting for me to find that 40% of global mangroves are currently under protected area status. And their goal by 2030 is to have that hit 80%. Now, as listeners might guess by how we've been talking about the concentration of mangroves in 4 countries and concentration of loss in 6, that next 40% is going to be harder than the first 40% by an order of magnitude.
Yeah, I think one more organization I think that's worth noting is that the Food and Agriculture Organization, that it's under the UN also. So we're talking about yet another UN way to try to, that's kind of, all of this stuff ends up being dumped on the UN. Oh, okay, you deal with this issue, right? But the fact that the FAO is really important and integral to saving mangroves, because it's tied directly to the agriculture that's causing the deforestation and the fishing and the fisheries and where these nutrients are coming from, and why it's important to have these for local people, because most of these occur in developing countries. And so depleting these, so the FAO has a vested interest also, even though it might seem like so far removed, a very vested interest in protecting these mangroves too. I think going back to, do you want to?
No.
Sorry.
Don't.
I just sort of railroaded on, how I can be. But so this made me think of Indonesia, right? Because Indonesia is an island chain. It has over 8 million acres of mangroves. It is the biggest. It's got more mangrove concentration than any other country in the world. And this is even after these statistics are from 2025, February of this year. And so, this is even after years of rapid forest deforestation due to the logging and the farming, the date palm oil planting and the monocropping that we talked about in part one, that it's also, as the world's biggest supplier of palm oil, along with neighboring Malaysia, also another rich, mangrove rich country, this is still, in fact, the largest area of mangroves in the world. Is estimated to be 20 to 25% of the whole entire globe is concentrated right there. And scientists estimate that Indonesia's coastlines store more than 3 billion tons of carbon dioxide. And this is, so this is just the storing. This does not even include all of the sucking in that it's doing on top of that, and all of the other great externality contributions, right? We always talk of externalities as this thing that is always dismissed, but in, mangroves, man, they've got externalities covered in spades, right? Because you've got the filtration and the stopping the coastal erosion and stopping the pollution and all of these things that they do, storm protections and barriers and so forth. And so that, on top of the fact that they're storing it, also sucking in more carbon dioxide. And so they actually want to increase their carbon trading. And this goes back to, so this connects us to, right, what they're doing in conjunction with the World Bank, which values these at $50,000 for every 2.5 acres. So there is a real economic incentive to conserve and restore lost mangroves, but they're expensive to replenish. So the one thing, and this goes to what you were saying, half of Indonesia's mangroves are considered of high quality, that they have minimal to no degradation, and that's great. But when we're looking at the 20 to 25% of the world's mangroves, and then you take half of that and you say, okay, the other half then means that you need to re-up these, replenish them, do something. And it's a costly venture to do this. And so it's worth it, certainly worth the investment. And a forestry study was done that estimates that they can generate up to $8,000 for every 1 and 2.5 acres. So every hectare, $8,000 they can generate every single year from fishing alone. That's not even all of the added benefits, right? So now the Indonesian government is looking at this and saying, hey, we have a real vested interest, economic interest, as an already emerging economy that's on the higher end of development, to really try to turn some resources toward this and do even more carbon offset trading.
No, and it's really a great example of trying to, drive that benefit. I'm still stuck a little bit in my brain on the 3 billion tons stored. Up in Canada, we think of the permafrost as a carbon bomb, right? That's stored. And I don't think anybody's ever actually, at least I haven't heard somebody describe the mangrove forests as another, unwitting carbon bomb that's sitting there. And I think that what you see there in Indonesia is really tying it into that economic, their broader economy, and like a national government looking at it in a broad way, right? It's interesting that so much of their mangroves are still, in good condition. Preparing for this episode, I found 2 interesting graphs that I'll send you so you can have in. And one is the IUCN's drivers of mangroves loss map. So you can see whether the area is facing loss from primarily human or nature, and it's different around the globe. But then also NASA did a global study with imagery of areas of endangered or healthy mangroves. And if you overlay them, the areas with natural loss as the primary driver are the areas that are still healthy mangroves. And the areas of human driver loss are all the critical areas. So you can rate, see, and understand, probably thinking of Indonesia. And, again, our sand episode comes up a few times in these two, but the disappearing island chains, right? So you can see where they're driving that is probably going to be kind of the critical areas, and areas that have not been touched yet are probably driving it. Just an interesting connection there.
Well, and this is something that, too, for the United States government, the NOAA, right? We talk about NOAA a lot on the show. It has a coastal blue carbon, a whole service that they do. And we're talking about a country that has very few mangroves, right, in the United States. And so, but here's something that still there's, the National Oceanic help me out here. National Oceanic Atmospheric Association of America. I don't know. It's like so many acronyms in the world that one of the things they're doing then is recognizing how important blue carbon mangroves and so forth are, and trying to do something to that end, even though just a tiny fraction in the United States alone.
Well, and I think that, one joke on the acronyms for listeners, I know my friend of mine, my comms manager, is always cringing when we just say the name. But I think there are so many acronyms in this space, and I don't know the last time I actually said NOAA out. It's been a decade or more of just NOAA, and we in the space. No, but this gets to the problem of who's paying for it, right? Who has to incentivize that, because it is an externality. And even though, ecological economists with biodiversity researchers and biologists can go in and show and categorize and say, here's what you're getting, to your point, unless those communities or the government can actually see a monetary benefit in their account from it, it's not going to matter more than a number on a spreadsheet. So the problem is, and that's why, going back to carbon markets as a way of really driving value and incentivizing those payments.
Well, that's the thing, is that everything in the capitalist system has to be quantifiable. And these are ways to quantify the contributions of the environment and the costs of losing these things in the environment. But if you can especially focus on what the contributions are and the potential gains from this, then hopefully there will be more entrepreneurial enterprises around that. Because if we're going to just rely on intergovernmental organizations to do this, or the extent to which NGOs get any decent amount of funding and volunteers and everything that they use to operate, it's got to be that combination of like corporations and countries trying to find ways to I keep using the word incentivize. I kind of hate it, but that's exactly what it is.
I make the joke that capitalism is a great and horrible system at the same time, because it's all about the alignment of incentives. And if incentives are aligned to negative outcomes, we will produce negative outcomes from here to the end of time. If incentives can be shifted to produce good outcomes in an intentional way, the system will just produce good outcomes till the end of time and overdo it there, right? There is no motivation behind it other than just what are we getting paid for? And
we can't blame the capitalist system. The capitalist system is just this thing that is based on supply and demand and wants and needs, and responses, responding to the market. The market responds to
and that's it. And it can produce a horrible outcome if we allow it, or it can produce great outcomes. And so whenever I hear critiques of capitalism, I always laugh. I'm like, well, it's a critique of society, actually, is what you're saying. But this gets to the second thing. We talked about carbon markets. There's one more that has me excited from multinational corporations. And it was the 2023 release from the Task Force on Nature-Related Disclosures. So this followed up in 2017, the first Task Force on Climate-Related Disclosures were released, which led to the largest increase in actual reporting and measuring of corporate carbon impacts. Because for the first time, it was really laid out for all companies to see how GHG emissions were a fiduciary risk to their shareholders. And it put it completely in the climate activists and some of my more, I'd say leftist friends were like, this isn't climate change. What are you talking about? You're talking about risk and impacts. But I was like, that's what corporations think in. That's what they need to see. And from my perspective, working in the field, like that release in 2017 changed the game and allowed companies to both talk with their boards, talk with their shareholders, and process it in a way they understood. And it led to, in my mind, awareness is the first step, understanding the problem. And so having companies releasing this information. So in 2023, nature-related disclosures were finally released. And so I'm hoping that as the next kind of decade goes on, we see this exact same ramp up in disclosures on mangroves, disclosures on forests, disclosures on the actual physical impacts, because that'll then allow us to start putting pressure and coming up with solutions for the companies and industries that are really driving it. So it's not a thing that'll incentivize profit or a financial incentive, but it puts that pressure on so that we can even name the problem.
Yeah, it's like translating it into a language that they understand, right?
Exactly.
That's what it's really about in this instance. So this seems like you're kind of hopeful in this regard, that here we have something that actually can really give a reason for businesses to get on board with protecting mangroves, as we're talking about, and dealing with carbon offsets and carbon emissions. You have other reasons why you're hopeful about this, or is it just like another one of the episodes we get to the end and we're both like, well.
No, so this one's really funny for me because I've known the entire time we were discussing this that I am hopeful. But even as we're talking, there was multiple times where I was thinking that if I was listening to the episode, I wouldn't know how Jordan was going to get to hope by the end of it. And so my hope on this is along two categories. First is where we're at gives me hope, and then incentives for the future. So starting with where we're at, and I think that is, pulling it back for a second, right? The rate of destruction is shrinking. So, for everybody living through inflation the last few years, yes, inflation high, but rate going down is still a good thing, right? And that's one of the big hopes for me is that the rate of destruction is shrinking. And even if we cut it in half from almost 1% annual loss to 0.5% annual loss, doubles the time that we have to deal with this, right? So I think massive change there. Second was that ability to recover damaged ecosystems, right? The fact that 69% of the loss in the last 20 years is able to be restored is something that gives me a lot of hope, because saving and restoring mangroves is possible. Replacing mangroves isn't, because once that system to hold that sediment in and anchor that ecosystem is fully lost, you can't, basically, because of how erosion works, you're not going to be able to put plants back. So that gives me hope. And then, as you kind of hit on a lot, awareness around this issue. Really, again, 42% of global mangroves are covered. I think as more and more countries have an awareness of the economic and ecosystem impacts, I think we will see that grow. Now, on the second side, it's kind of where we're going and the incentives. And we talked about them here, right? The carbon markets and the sophistication of mechanisms to flow funds for those benefits, as well as my kind of future look at the disclosure and being able to name and point to, because again, no company wants to be the worst, at least not publicly. So the second that we can say, oh, wow, you are the world's worst company for mangroves, I guarantee you'll see that company investing money in the next 2 years to not be the world's worst, right? So that is what's driving my hope, that this might not reach the point of some of the other issues, that it's a tipping point. And then, so you look at coral reefs. Wow. Kimberly, it's my turn to have a rental tongue today. No, when you look at coral reefs, in some ways, we're at a tipping point where they're almost guaranteed that past 2100, they will be destroyed. We're not there with mangroves. And I hope that we never hit that point.
And the coral reefs actually have a better chance of hope if the mangroves are doing better also. So another reason, if you like coral reefs and you like, diving and so forth, here's a good reason to care about mangroves. Something you've never really heard about.
Yeah, what about you, Kimberly?
Well, I also, like you, I feel like when I actually really started looking at the numbers for these things, that the situation in the scenario isn't just already a foregone conclusion. So I think in that regard, and the fact that mangroves have gotten far more attention in the last decade as people realize how important they are. And also because of the blue carbon aspect of that. And there's just so much more concern and attention to how do we capture carbon dioxide and how do we offset that? I think that even if the average individual isn't hearing about this, corporations are far more sort of in tune with this. I always I don't know, because the pros and cons of carbon trading. Like, I definitely think here's something too, because it's built into the capitalist system, and it's something that, as you were talking about, if we start using that language that those in the capitalist system can relate to and understand, then that's promising, much more so than just going on saying, save the mangroves, save the mangroves. And so I think though my concerns always are, okay, well, we need to have, it's that catch-22, right? In order for development to happen, you have to have money going into these developing areas, but where is that money going to come from? And right now, a lot of those developing countries, especially now talking about mangroves, they don't have that extra money for those what I always think of as back burner policy issues. You got to care about, like, are your people getting vaccinated? Are they getting adequate nutrition? What is the latest,
child mortality?
Yeah, exactly. Those sorts of things. Can we get the diarrhea rates down amongst children below, under 5, and all of those things are just really hard pressing issues. And then, well, you're not going to get the sort of funding and backing and attention and loans and everything that you need in the international community unless you've got hard economic data that you're developing, if you've got a good credit rating. And so when you start looking at those financial aspects and the investment aspects and all that political economy stuff, what even something as basic as what is the value of the currency today? Like when you start looking at all those things, like as the government, you have to. That's got to be number one, right in front of your face on your radar. And the mangroves be damned. So that's the hard thing when I come down to it, and I know how the world works. This is why the idealist in me is always crushed when I see what the reality seems to be, but then when we go through this episode and actually look at the numbers and stuff, then I feel a little bit more hopeful, which is why I can see too what you were saying as people were listening, just going through like, oh wow, how are they going to come out of the back end of this? But then also maybe hearing those numbers, people were a little more like, oh yeah, I can be a little optimistic about this.
Yeah, I think the hard part of diving into these, right? Like you get into the details of why it's so bad, and it seems like it's even worse than when you kind of do it at a high level. But conversely, knowing the actual scope, right, and knowing the current state can make it less nebulous. And I find that usually is what, it's not even that I think that it's better than I thought, right? Because again, the fact that we've already lost 30%, right? We're not great, but it's naming it to tame it, that fear, right? Putting some of the numbers around it and understanding the scope takes it out of this, it's a lot scary just to say we're losing all our mangroves. Then here's the numbers and here's what's happening and where the pressures are. And now we can look at it, right?
Well, I think also it's a much more tangible thing that people can relate to. Unlike we just talk about climate change as, like you said, this big, giant, multifaceted behemoth thing. And like, what on earth can I possibly as an individual do? But I, as an individual, can go and visit mangroves and take enjoyment out of them. And then maybe I have more of an incentive to, hey, like, okay, I'm going to donate a little, so what? I donate $5 or something, or I went and I gave a little extra money when I went to go visit, whatever. That's something that can make a bit of a difference.
Or even just knowing that they're not just this cool local feature that you've grown up with, but they're actually a major driver of benefits to the globe. Like, I think those deeper connections with a place, right? And how important it is something that can drive sustainability efforts as well. So,
yeah. So if you liked what we did by breaking this episode up into two, let us know. If you missed part one, go back and listen to part one of Mangroves. If you enjoyed the episode, please let us know and contact us, especially by email at splanetpod@gmail.com. We're on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube. You'll find these links to our show notes on our website, along with additional resources from today's episode and my Substack posts that are always relevant somehow. We'd really appreciate if you'd rate and review Sustainable Planet on your podcast app. And thanks for listening. Have a sustainable day.